Nancy Guthrie was swallowed by the shadows, leaving behind forensic inconsistencies and a heavy, suffocating silence that screams for answers. The pathology of this disappearance suggests a predator operating within the darkest corners of institutional neglect and failure. 66 days have evaporated into the Arizona heat while this family remains trapped in a clinical void. No pulse, no sightings, and no coordinates. The FBI is processing data while the public constructs theories, but we have been forensically deconstructing every lead and logical thread for weeks. We analyze the genetic markers, the undisturbed ceramic of the flower pot, the forced rear entry, the stage departure, and the contractor's specific timeline. Every tactical angle of the neighboring vacant lot has been scrutinized. For 66 days, those efforts resulted in nothing but a high-tension stalemate. Official channels offered no public resolution. However, a breakthrough surfaced tonight from a correspondent who has been sending data for months. This subject is known to federal agents and Harvey Levin, the founder of TMZ, a man who operates at the intersection of high-stakes information. Levin has personally scrutinized every digitized communication since the messages began streaming in this past February. He watched as these critical leads were absorbed into the opaque machinery of federal bureaucracy without producing a single visible forensic result. Tonight, for the first time in this 66-day investigation, the sender provided a specific geographic location, ending the strategic silence of the perpetrator. We will reach those coordinates shortly. To grasp why this specific note matters, you must analyze why Harvey Levin's reaction tonight was unprecedented. You need to understand the psychological profile of this sender and the unsettling history behind their persistent engagement with the media. This is not a random tip. It is the culmination of a psychological escalation that began on February 1st and has intensified ever since. If you trace this behavioral thread to its conclusion tonight, you realize the end of the line is occupied by something tangible. Who is behind these messages? Let us examine the February contact history. Within hours of Nancy Guthrie's abduction from her Tucson residence, she vanished from her home on the morning of February 1st, and almost immediately, a subject began a relentless campaign to contact TMZ. The communication was not sporadic. Levin described the behavior as incessant, an obsessive, pathological need to engage with the news outlet. These messages demanded specific amounts of cryptocurrency in exchange for evidence the sender claimed to possess regarding Nancy Guthrie's current status. We must be logically precise regarding the Vegas contact because this community requires forensic clarity over mere speculation. The individual engaging TMZ is distinct from the typical opportunists and predators who attempt to exploit high-profile disappearances for attention. Fraudsters have already attempted to infect this investigation. The Pima County Sheriff's Office previously processed an arrest for a separate extortion attempt. That arrest involved a clumsy, fraudulent ransom demand unrelated to the TMZ logs. Bottom feeders have tried to capitalize on this tragedy since day one. But the TMZ correspondent is different, a consistent, calculating entity with a specific, disturbing knowledge base that separates them from the noise. We cannot verify their morality. However, what isolates this subject is not their honesty, but the specific forensic data they appeared to hold. The nature of that information forced Harvey Levin onto a national broadcast to dissect the implications of these unauthorized disclosures. In early February, Levin appeared on Fox News and presented a detail that shifted the entire logical framework of the search. He revealed that the initial ransom communication contained verified facts about the crime scene that had never been released to the general public. This was not data found in news cycles or press briefings, it was forensic information that existed only within the victim's private residence. Two specific details demonstrated an intimate, almost voyeuristic familiarity with the interior layout of Nancy Guthrie's home. The first detail concerned the exact physical placement of Nancy's Apple Watch inside the house. Consider the level of access required for that. Knowing she owned the technology is common. Knowing the specific room and the exact orientation of the device is a forensic marker of presence. That level of granular detail, the precise location of a personal object, cannot be guessed from a sidewalk or a low-resolution photograph. It indicates either direct physical entry into the residence or a source with a high-definition view of her private daily life. The second detail involved a damaged floodlight, a structural defect on the property that was not visible from the public street. No journalist had reported this mechanical failure at the time Levin disclosed it. It was a secret held by the house. Knowledge of this specific physical condition requires the author to have occupied that space or received intelligence from someone who had. Levin concluded that the sender had either crossed the threshold of that home or was working with the individual who did. He stated that based on the geographic clues in the notes, his instinct placed Nancy within a specific radius of the Tucson area. He described a cone of probability stretching from the Arizona desert toward the New Mexico border, a vast, desolate hunting ground. At that stage, this crude map was more definitive than any official statement released by the FBI or local law enforcement. Every digital fingerprint from this source was immediately transferred to the FBI for forensic examination without delay. TMZ maintained total transparency with federal investigators regarding the timeline and content of every single message received. Without exception, the outlet ensured that every byte of data was handed over to the Bureau's Cybercrime Division for tracing. Every syllable from this source is now in a federal file, while the clock on Nancy's survival continues its silent, rhythmic countdown. Harvey Levin refused to hoard these investigative details for profit while intentionally freezing out federal law enforcement during the search. Every byte hit the Bureau's desks, yet months later, Levin observed a total, inexplicable lack of federal kinetic motion. The agency offered no visible response to these leads, maintaining a sterile, frustrating silence throughout the active investigation. No official validation or dismissal emerged, only a dark void the anonymous source watched with predatory interest. That realization, watching weeks of outreach vanish into a federal black hole, ignited a dangerous, pathological frustration in the sender. We must examine the February note to identify the specific forensic details that forced Levin's hand. Analyzing this midwinter correspondence is vital because it exposes the deteriorating psychological state of the unidentified individual. It provides the baseline for why the tactical developments of April 6th shattered the existing timeline. On February 6th, only 5 days after Nancy vanished, Levin spoke to Hannity with cold, calculated precision. He emphasized that the correspondence was not a frantic, low-effort forgery or a rushed attempt at extortion. This was a methodical construction, lacking the typical linguistic errors found in amateur attempts to exploit a tragedy. The document signaled a deep intimacy with the crime scene that only a primary participant would possess. Levin categorized the Apple Watch specifics as a vital corroborative pillar rather than a lucky guess. It wasn't definitive proof of life, but it was a forensic match that defied standard statistical probability. The watch mattered because 84-year-old Nancy relied on a pacemaker to keep her heart beating. That cardiac device severed its uplink to the monitoring server at exactly 2:28 on February 1st. That hardware failure provides a clinical digital timestamp for the exact moment her biological life was likely interrupted. The predator's knowledge of the watch's location implies a terrifyingly intimate proximity to the victim's private routine. This initial ransom note carried strict temporal ultimatums, starting with a Thursday cutoff that passed without action. By the time Levin hit the airwaves, a secondary, far more lethal deadline was looming on Monday. The demand specified a verified Bitcoin wallet address, confirming this was a high-stakes, calculated financial play. Federal agents worked with private cybersecurity teams attempting to pierce the veil of the sender's sophisticated encryption. Despite the Bureau's massive resources, the digital trail ended in a total blackout for the investigative team. This source utilized advanced obfuscation techniques that baffled elite cybercrime investigators at the highest federal levels. We are not looking at a script kiddie or a bottom-feeding opportunist in this specific case. Standard grifters do not maintain operational security against a full-scale federal forensic sweep of their communications. This lack of a traceable digital footprint by early February confirms a high level of predatory technical proficiency. While technical skill does not equal truth, it separates this individual from the noise of typical imposters. Levin walked a razor's edge, constantly reminding the public he lacked official investigative or police credentials. He refused to fully validate the letter, yet he could not ignore the raw, corroborative data it contained. That tense neutrality held firm until the morning of April 6th, when the operational reality shifted. Then came the void weeks of absolute, heavy silence from the anonymous source after those early contacts. Deadlines lapsed, federal eyes remained fixed on the case, and the outgoing messages simply ceased. The investigation ground forward in a vacuum, bolstered only by grainy doorbell footage from the property. Footage showed a masked gunman on the porch. The physical evidence consisted of confirmed dark blood spatters. Sheriff Chris Nanos faced the cameras, while forensic analysts began mapping the carnage left behind. Experts like Jennifer Coffindaffer and Maureen O'Connell scrutinized the tactical movements of the unidentified suspect. Genetic genealogists at Parabon Nanolabs searched for a biological match while the trail went cold. Every analyst and content creator was shouting into the ether, but the sender remained curiously quiet. In a world of digital noise and whiteboard theories, this sudden cessation of contact was deafening. When a previously obsessive communicator abruptly cuts all ties, the psychological motive usually turns incredibly dark. The source had displayed pathological persistence before vanishing into total, uncharacteristic obscurity. Perhaps the sender's physical location was compromised, forcing a sudden and desperate tactical retreat from the game. Fear of exposure often triggers this type of forensic blackout when the stakes become fatal for them. Or the skeptical view. The predator realized the digital net was finally beginning to tighten. They folded the moment the clinical reality of a federal homicide probe threatened their operation. Harvey Levin stated on air that executing a scam of this scale is a federal felony. The recipient processed the warning. The mystery lies in how they chose to weaponize it. A third theory persists. A predator was watching, calculating the investigation's every move from the darkness. They waited for a precise psychological window when their contact would inflict the most damage. That scenario is more menacing than the rest, aligning with the evidence from April 6th. It explains the anomalies. April 6th, 2026. Savannah Guthrie returns to the desk. Before we analyze the April 6th communication, we must dissect the gravity of that specific date. The timing was no accident. It was surgical. Monday, April 6th, 2026. Guthrie resumed her role at the Today Show, ending a 2-month hiatus defined by familial trauma. She had withdrawn after her mother's abduction. The network provided a necessary period of isolation. Millions of viewers, a captive national audience, waited to witness the public return of a grieving daughter. Her peers maintained the broadcast, but her empty chair remained a stark monument to the missing. She returned wearing a yellow dress. This was a deliberate, highly visible signal to the public. Yellow is the chromatic anchor of this search, the rallying point for a devastated community. It defines the vigils and the digital campaigns launched to find Nancy Guthrie after her disappearance. Wearing that hue on national television was a defiant statement against the silence of the abductor. The message: I am present, she is still gone, and my resolve has not fractured. The atmosphere was thick with clinical stress as colleagues welcomed her back under the studio lights. She maintained a rigid professional composure, masking the internal collapse of a daughter in crisis. She returned because the world offers no reprieve for the families of the vanished. Survival requires motion, even when progress feels like a betrayal to the victim left behind. This was the psychological weight of April 6th, before the next forensic anomaly surfaced. Simultaneously, as Guthrie stood before the cameras, a predator was finalizing their next digital strike. Levin and Ladabaudiere were filming when a new forensic anomaly hit their server. Mid-broadcast, a transmission arrived from an address already flagged by their security team. The subject returned, choosing this date with a precision that suggests a sophisticated, obsessive motive. Levin broke cover to read the message. This is the verbatim transcript of that demand. On April 6th, 2026, Levin addressed his audience with a grim update. The individual fixated on this case resumed contact today after a period of tactical silence. The email contained a specific dual claim: knowledge of the body and the kidnapper's identity. Demand: 0.5 Bitcoin for the information. We must now break this down forensically. Point 1. I know where her body is. This explicitly shifts the case to homicide. This is a confirmation of death, claiming possession of the exact coordinates of Nancy's remains. Point 2. The identity of the abductor. The sender purports to hold the key to conviction. Point 3. A demand for 0.5 Bitcoin. This is a high-stakes financial extortion attempt. The extortionist structured the deal with a half-payment deposit, followed by a final payment upon arrest. This performance-based model is atypical. Low-level scammers prioritize immediate, total liquidation of their targets. They demand full payment before the victim identifies the fraud. Their only metric is speed. Collect the cash, cut ties, and vanish. This is the hallmark of a standard fraud. A payment tied to a specific law enforcement outcome deviates from the typical extortion profile. It anchors the payoff to a verified arrest, suggesting the source has verifiable intelligence. The source is gambling 50% of their profit on the accuracy of their forensic data. While potentially manipulative, this structure lacks the frantic desperation of a common digital grift. This is the logic of a predator who believes they possess absolute leverage over a corpse. The informant felt the cold weight of a system that had failed them, the sharp, bitter tone of a witness who has been repeatedly silenced by the state. This leads us to the most surgical revelation from the April 6th dispatch, the calculated fury dripping from the forensic analysis of that specific text. Per investigative files initially broken by the press and corroborated by secondary intelligence, we have acquired the specific contents of the April 6th communication. We are examining the verbatim text because this syntax is forensic evidence. It is a psychological map of an individual disgusted that. Millions of tax dollars have been incinerated by police while I have been standing here since February 11th, ready to hand them over on a silver platter. All for a single Bitcoin, yet you treat me like a common hustler. They walk free while the case sits on ice, fueled by bureaucratic vanity. It is pure, unadulterated arrogance. Deconstruct that. Millions wasted. This individual is meticulously auditing the entire state-funded manhunt and its failure. They are acutely aware of the bounty, the forensic assets, and the tactical boots on the ground. This is not the rambling of a distant observer. This is someone hovering over the investigation, cataloging every perceived tactical blunder and every dollar spent on a strategy that yielded nothing, delivering them on a silver platter. In the mind of an informant, that phrase signals the possession of high-value, actionable intelligence that could end this. You do not use the imagery of a feast unless you are holding the main course, and then there is that specific anchor, February 11th. February 11th falls exactly 10 days after Nancy vanished into the cold air of January. It is a distinct departure from the initial chaos of the search. This informant claims they surfaced 10 days into the grid search, bypassing the critical 48-hour window where most leads go cold and panic sets in. While the initial flood of grifters choked the tip lines, this person waited until 10 days had passed, a timestamp that demands forensic scrutiny of the logs. What internal or external catalyst forced a person with lethal knowledge to finally break their silence on that specific Tuesday? We cannot say for certain, yet the precision of the 11th, not mid-February, not the start, is the type of rigid detail that rarely populates a fabricated or opportunistic narrative. The case is frozen. That clinical assessment is telling, suggesting a total disconnect between the public-facing investigation and the sender's private reality. From a press standpoint, the gears were turning, cameras were rolling at podiums, and analysts were scrubbing hours of grainy surveillance loops for a ghost. But for someone screaming into a void since February 11th with zero tactical feedback, the entire machine looked completely paralyzed and incompetent. From their narrow, dark vantage point, the investigation is dead in the water because their specific key hasn't been used to turn the lock. They offered the kill shot and were treated like static noise, disregarded as a scam that is the narcissistic wound that fuels this entire exchange. This person was likely told, perhaps through the deafening silence of the Federal Bureau, that their intel was deemed low credibility or a fraudulent distraction. Being branded a con artist when you believe you hold the truth creates a specific kind of volatile resentment, not fear of capture, but pure rage. This is the vitriol of a person who isn't sweating a lie, but who is seething because their truth is being treated as worthless trash. The dispatch also meticulously carved out the sender's role in the horror. They were desperate to establish a boundary of absolute innocence. They insist they did not snatch Nancy. They were nowhere near the primary scene on that Tuesday night of January 31st. They framed themselves as a shadow witness, someone who happened upon Nancy while she was in the custody of her actual violent predators. They claim to have crossed paths with the captors and now believe they are sitting on the one piece of evidence that breaks the world. The logic fails them. They cannot fathom why the authorities are ignoring the smoking gun they are holding out in the dark. The sender alleged they were beyond the border, a detail that explains why they saw her outside Tucson and why they remained silent so long. Direct contact with the feds becomes a lethally complex game when you are operating from the shadows or an international jurisdiction. We are presenting the anatomy of this note as it was written. A single, unverified, and dangerously anonymous set of claims from an unknown. Then, a second transmission hit the inbox shortly after the first, changing the frequency of the entire psychological profile of the sender. Another digital packet from the same source, time-stamped on that same morning of April 6th, arrived to complicate the narrative further and faster. This second message introduced a jarring pivot that forced a total reevaluation of the sender's initial claims and their ultimate motives. The first message was a death notice. "I know where the body is." It framed the entire extortion attempt around a recovery mission. But the second dispatch retreated from that finality, pivoting away from a corpse and toward a living, breathing victim in the present tense. This was a tactical shift toward a timeline where Nancy was still alive, moving the goalposts from a grave to a hostage situation. The sender now claimed to have observed Nancy in the flesh, held captive by the individuals who had originally taken her from the street. One breath claims she is dead, the next insists she was seen alive at a specific coordinate. The discrepancy is deafening. Consider that contradiction through a forensic lens. It is either a sign of a decaying lie or a more complex psychological manipulation of the target. In the mind of a predator or a scammer, total confusion creates a vacuum of urgency, forcing the target to act before they can think. It is a classic high-pressure tactic. Flood the victim with conflicting data so they pay the ransom just to stop the spinning world. You paralyze the target by contradicting yourself, preventing any logical pushback through pure informational overload and psychological exhaustion. Yet there is a second interpretation, one that is far more disturbing and, for some investigators, potentially more credible. "I saw her alive." The sender utilizes a clinical past tense, intentionally separating Nancy's pulse from the current, darker reality of her disappearance. This specific communication alleges an encounter with Nancy Guthrie alongside unidentified individuals at an undisclosed point prior to the note's drafting. They had taken her. The witness offers no confirmation of her current status, leaving a haunting, hollow void where a human life once existed. These claims of her death likely mirror the sender's grim deduction of what followed that final fleeting sighting in the Arizona wild. Essentially, they saw her breathing, but now conclude she is cold. This progression reconciles the apparent contradictions between the two forensic messages. The data points are sequential. First a sighting, then the presumed expiration, then the calculated decision to contact the outside world. The veracity of this timeline remains unproven, yet the internal logic of the two notes forms a cohesive, albeit terrifying, narrative structure. This is the most granular external intelligence received in 66 days. It breaks a 2-month silence with surgical, geographic precision. We must examine this specificity. The mention of Sonora, Mexico, shifts the tactical landscape of the entire search effort into a foreign theater. That location was identified in the second note, surfaced by TMZ, and verified through independent channels by Newsweek's investigative team. The verbatim text as reported states, "I saw her alive with the in the state of Sonora, Mexico. It is a jagged admission." The syntax collapses. "I saw her alive with the what?" The clinical sentence fractures before the object can be named. Perhaps the transmission was severed, or perhaps the informant's survival instinct overrode their desire to name the perpetrators in that second. It suggests a message typed in a state of high arousal fear, characterized by frantic keystrokes and a sudden loss of operational focus. We present the raw text exactly as recorded. Every missing noun and broken phrase is a potential forensic clue in this digital trail. Despite the grammatical disintegration, the premise is undeniable. The sender maintains they were a witness to Nancy Guthrie's survival in the past. She was positioned within a group in Sonora. To understand the gravity of this claim, we must map the geography of the investigation. Sonora sits as Mexico's northernmost Pacific gateway. It shares a desolate, porous land border with the southern edge of Arizona's desert. Primary transit corridors from Arizona into Sonora pass through Nogales, roughly 65 miles south of the Tucson city limits. Other exit points include Douglas, leading to Agua Prieta, and Lukeville, the dusty threshold connecting directly to the town of Sonora. Under standard driving conditions, any of these international crossings are reachable from Tucson within 60 to 120 minutes. Sonora is vast, covering approximately 70,571 square miles of territory that provides ample room for concealment. Its scale mirrors that of Oklahoma. Naming an entire state provides a region, not a specific coordinate or a searchable urban grid. However, in a case that languished for 66 days in a total information vacuum, any geographic marker is a significant forensic development. A named state is a massive upgrade from total silence. The logistics of a move to Sonora are grounded in cold, hard reality. If the objective was to extract a victim from Tucson, the southern border of Arizona serves as the primary tactical corridor. Nogales is less than 1 hour away. The landscape between Tucson and the fence is a well-worn path for illicit transit. If Nancy was taken, if the blood on the porch and the disabled security feed were the start, then her location has likely shifted. Moving her south into Mexico is a calculated operational move designed to paralyze domestic law enforcement and exploit jurisdictional boundaries. Cross-border abductions are real. They require high-level coordination between United States federal agents and their counterparts in Mexican law enforcement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Phoenix Field Office possesses the necessary institutional weight to manage a complex international search of this magnitude. They interface with Mexican federales. If the Bureau has intelligence regarding Sonora, the legal machinery for a recovery operation is already primed. We cannot verify if that international trigger has been pulled or if the evidence truly points toward a southern trajectory. What remains certain is that the investigative infrastructure is prepared to act if this lead proves to be more than a ghost. For the first time, a name and a place exist, a specific territory identified by a source that refuses to go away. Federal agents have held this information since February. If true, it necessitates a total recalibration of the search's strategic orientation. The case transforms instantly from a local missing persons search into a high-stakes international kidnapping investigation with massive implications. This is not a minor pivot. This is either the definitive breakthrough that finds her or something much more sinister. It could be a masterclass in professional misdirection. This is the exact paradox that Harvey Levin began to dissect. On April 6th, Levin expressed a visceral intuition. He sensed a specific gravity behind this particular claim, a reason to believe. We must analyze Harvey Levin's reaction. His response on April 6th has become the psychological epicenter of this unfolding mystery. As the founder of TMZ, Levin has navigated the dark underbelly of breaking news and forensic reporting for several decades. He forged a media empire that thrives on accuracy, or at the very least, on the brutal speed of being first. Levin is not prone to televised sentimentality. He does not trade in hope or the fragile comfort of wishful thinking. He understands the cold difference between a hollow rumor and a lead that carries the heavy weight of forensic truth. He knows. In his world, skepticism is the only professional standard. He viewed this anonymous sender through a lens of extreme clinical doubt. For several months, he meticulously archived these early contacts, flagging them for the FBI while maintaining a sterile and professional broadcast distance. He issued constant warnings that this intelligence remained unverified and isolated, a single-source narrative that could potentially trigger severe federal prosecution. This was the calculated strategy of a man managing volatile data he couldn't quantify. He refused to sound a false alarm regarding the sender. His tone remained analytical until April 6th. On that afternoon, Harvey Levin shifted, stepping before the camera lens to finally break his silence. I need to present his reasoning here, because the clinical logic behind his shift is more telling than the conclusion he eventually reached. Reports from The Wrap, Irish Star, and Mirror US all captured Levin's visceral gut reaction. His internal radar insisted there was something uniquely authentic about this individual. Point 1. An early email insisted that time was of the essence, a classic psychological tactic designed to force a rapid response. Then, 24 hours later, he claimed time was no longer critical. In a typical extortion scam, you never bleed out your own pressure. Scammers demand high stakes to maintain value. This voluntary de-escalation suggested a source operating on a different, more grounded and realistic psychological frequency. Dissect this argument carefully. It is not an emotional reaction, it is cold, forensic behavioral analysis. Levin isn't claiming personal trust. He is observing that the sender's erratic shifts fail to mirror the rigid, predictable profile of a fraudster. The sudden removal of a ticking clock is a fascinating anomaly. Consider the precise mechanics of how a criminal deception functions. Every predatory scheme relies on one core biological trigger: urgency. They weaponize time, forcing the victim into a panicked, irrational mindset. The fear of an expiring window is the scammer's primary tool. A professional con artist never removes the pressure, they only escalate it. They manufacture scarcity and impose deadlines to prevent logical thought. This sender did the exact opposite of that predatory profile. In the initial contact, the source claimed the clock was running out. In the subsequent message, they completely abandoned that tactical leverage. They walked back the threat. Within the psychological framework of fraud, this is a catastrophic error no professional manipulator would make. You don't just hand over your leverage for nothing. You don't turn down the heat when that pressure is your only weapon. But this behavior fits a source navigating a real situation. Someone drowning in genuine fear and calculating risk in an unstable environment. It's the profile of a source calculating life or death risks across multiple fronts, paralyzed by the uncertainty of their next move. Their urgency wasn't a manufactured script. It was situational. When the external reality shifted, the internal pressure of the message shifted. A human being trapped in a crisis reacts to the environment. A fraudster following a script lacks that organic, psychological flexibility. That is the core of Levin's logic, and it carries weight. It's the same behavioral metric investigators use to evaluate credibility. Analysts don't just look at words. They track how a source's behavior evolves across a timeline to determine if they are authentic. Predators follow a predictable script. Real informants are messy and reactive. Charles Latibaudiere, the veteran producer, reached the same cold conclusion. He co-signed the assessment on that same broadcast, noting the strange, non-linear progression of the anonymous sender's specific demands. While we lack the full classified file, from an analytical standpoint, it appears this individual possesses insider knowledge of the victim's case. Both professionals are framing this with extreme caution. They aren't declaring the note a fact, but they sense a disturbing pattern. They aren't confirming the victim is in Sonora yet. They are stating that across months of observation, this pattern feels real. This is a calculated judgment from two veterans who have spent decades filtering out the static of high-profile hoaxes. The authorities are moving in the shadows. Both notes from April 6th have been funneled directly to the federal agents. Levin confirmed the handoff on national television, a move corroborated by subsequent investigative reporting across major news outlets. Newsweek verified the transfer on April 6th. This information is no longer a media tip. It is evidence in a file. A Pima County Sheriff's Office spokesperson admitted they are tracking reports of ransom notes potentially linked to this vanishing. Officials confirmed that every lead is taken seriously and funneled to the detectives working the front lines alongside the FBI. They maintained a rigid wall of silence, stating that all inquiries regarding specific ransom notes must go through the Bureau itself. At the moment this record was finalized, the FBI had maintained a total blackout, neither validating nor dismissing the notes. This silence is not an oversight. It is the standard clinical procedure of an active federal kidnapping investigation in the field. The Bureau does not provide public validation for tips. They do not confirm what their informants are whispering in the dark. The void of information from the FBI tells us nothing about the actual progress of the boots on the ground. What it does confirm is that the Bureau is in possession of this data, a repeat contact active since February. This is a source that previously provided non-public details so significant that Levin felt compelled to describe them on television. Now, that same source has provided a specific geographic claim, a location in the desolate, high-risk reaches of Sonora, Mexico. The Bureau is now holding that location, waiting to see if the trail leads to a grave. Jennifer Coffindaffer, an elite FBI profiler, identifies a predator's signature in the latest case developments. Her forensic analysis on X dissected the predatory timing behind the message received on April 6th. She isolated a disturbing synchronicity between the note's delivery and the family's most vulnerable public moment. Regardless of the sender's actual knowledge, Coffindaffer argues the timing indicates a calculated psychological strike. Reaching out exactly when Savannah returned to work reveals a motive rooted in intentional trauma triggering. The analyst labeled the perpetrator a sick creature, profiling a mind driven by cruelty rather than information. This was no coincidence. It was a targeted maneuver designed to maximize the family's emotional devastation. A voyeur is monitoring the family's public schedule, choosing specific milestones to re-enter the narrative. Coffindaffer's assessment exposes a dark reality missed by mainstream outlets, focusing solely on the note's text. The timing's metadata identifies a stalker-like obsession with the professional timeline of the victim's inner circle. They weaponized an emotionally charged return to the airwaves to reassert their presence in this tragedy. This individual is forcibly injecting themselves into the most agonizing day of the family's public experience. Such specific behavioral patterns distinguish a sophisticated actor from a random internet troll seeking attention. We must determine if this is a parasitic opportunist or someone with intimate case knowledge. Random opportunists lack the discipline required for such surgical timing after weeks of total silence. Resurfacing precisely when the cameras went live suggests a level of focus bordering on professional surveillance. That precision indicates either direct involvement in the crime or a pathology defined by lethal obsession. Both possibilities carry weight as we analyze the tactical significance of the Sonora, Mexico claims. We must evaluate the Sonora lead with a cold, objective lens to understand its geographic reality. Sonora is a massive, complex Mexican state sharing a porous border with the Arizona desert. It is anchored by Hermosillo, a city of 1 million, providing easy urban anonymity for fugitives. The frontier is defined by chaotic border hubs like Nogales and Agua Prieta. The terrain shifts violently from scorched desert floor to the jagged Sierra Madre Occidental peaks. It is an environment of extremes, offering both sophisticated urban infrastructure and total rural isolation. For a suspect in Tucson, the path to Sonora is a direct high-speed descent south. Nogales sits 65 miles down Interstate 19, an international crossing that never sleeps. When Nancy vanished on February 1st, those border gates were fully accessible in the pre-dawn hours. 1:47 a.m., the camera dies. 2:12 a.m., motion is detected in the dark. By 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker's digital pulse had flatlined on the monitoring app. Under the cover of darkness, the drive to the Mexican border takes less than 90 minutes. We are not confirming Nancy reached Sonora, but the logistics are terrifyingly sound. The geographic corridor exists, and the window for an international extraction remains wide open. Crossing international lines immediately would blind domestic law enforcement's initial response during those critical hours. This strategic maneuver complicates a search while local authorities are still mobilizing resources. Recall Harvey Levin's February theory placing Nancy within a radius extending toward New Mexico. Levin looked east, but the southern route into Mexico offered a cleaner, more immediate escape. His core point was proximity to Tucson. Sonora sits deep within that lethal radius. It fits the geographic world he described, regardless of the specific compass heading mentioned. Sonora is reachable enough to explain the sender's intimate grasp of Nancy's private home details. Knowing the floodlight and Apple Watch mechanics suggests a proximity that is far from accidental. This is a logical, analytical inference based on spatial facts, not a speculative leap. This community must hold this level of nuance as the investigation enters a darker phase. The next move belongs to the FBI and their specialized cross-border investigative assets. Federal agents possess the notes and the legal authority to chase this lead into Mexico. We are tracking the Bureau's response to this sudden, calculated reemergence. 66 days of silence for Nancy Guthrie. She is an 84-year-old grandmother whose life was suddenly and violently severed from her quiet suburban Tucson home and her family. She is medically dependent on a pacemaker and a strict daily chemical regimen. Her family now survives within a vacuum of the most agonizing, unresolved psychological trauma. Over 2 months have passed since she vanished into the Arizona night, disappearing from her Tucson residence without leaving behind a single physical witness or sign of struggle. Public confirmation of her status remains at zero, but a persistent anonymous source has been funneling specific data to TMZ since early February. These preliminary messages contain specific forensic details that Harvey Levin deemed significant enough to describe on national television broadcasts during his report. The source reappeared on April 6th with 2 distinct transmissions. The first specified a burial site and demanded 0.5 Bitcoin for the exact coordinates. The second claim alleged Nancy was seen alive, held by a group that had forcibly transported her across the desert border into Sonora, Mexico. TMZ surrendered both communications to the FBI on the day of arrival, permanently logging them into the federal record of this active investigation. Harvey Levin has remained clinically detached regarding this sender for months, meticulously documenting and forwarding every single digital scrap to federal law enforcement agents. He functioned as a sterile conduit for this anonymous source, refusing to cloud the investigation with premature conclusions or his own personal theories. On April 6th, he shifted his stance, admitting that his professional intuition now suggests this individual possesses genuine, high-level knowledge of Nancy's case. He cited the sender's behavioral profile, noting a lack of the erratic patterns typically associated with low-level, uneducated, and desperate financial scammers. He stated this on camera. Charles Latibaudiere concurred, while retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer analyzed the sender's predatory and precise timing. Coffindaffer analyzed the sender's manipulative architecture as the Pima County Sheriff confirmed that all incoming intelligence is being triaged directly to the FBI. Federal investigators maintain a total information blackout, a calculated tactical silence that reveals nothing about the current viability of these specific cross-border leads. We face a sharp contradiction tonight. One digital note claims she is dead, the other insists she is currently alive. A specific location has been identified, and a veteran investigator admits his logical intuition has finally been triggered by this anonymous source. Is there a physical reality in Sonora, Mexico, or is a predator studying Savannah Guthrie's professional schedule to time their psychological strikes? Is this a calculated attempt at maximum psychological warfare, or is a witness burdened by truth trying to find a way to speak? Can this information be verified without a ransom payment, or has a clever opportunist simply made a lucky geographic guess about the location? We are presenting the documented evidence, the verified statements from officials, and the transparency that the Tucson community is currently being denied. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That is the only forensic fact that matters, a cold, unmoving truth that remains entirely unchanged by these conflicting anonymous notes. Analyze those two notes. The handwriting vibrates with a deceptive energy that sharply contradicts every known forensic fact. That contingency payment isn't just money. It reveals a transactional mindset and Harvey Levin's cold behavioral logic. Sonora, Mexico remains a black hole in this timeline, a coordinate that defies logic and conceals a darker truth. Every fragment of data is scrutinized under a forensic lens, tracking the movements of the missing relentlessly. The evidence trail winds through a labyrinth of sworn statements, each one more damning than the last. Every unverified claim is isolated, stripping away noise to expose the predatory patterns hidden in the static. In the vacuum where Nancy Guthrie once stood, the lack of a suspect becomes the most terrifying evidence. This is an objective autopsy of a cold case, performed with surgical precision and the coldness of graves. The community remains on edge, dissecting every frame of the forensic timeline for a single, missed physiological tell. Investigators are tracing digital echoes, searching for signals at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Dial 1-800-225-5324, the final connection to the truth.